My name is Valerie Joyce and I'm accompanied by Robin Davis, members of the Mount Sorrel Heritage Group. We're here today to recall the memories of Stephen Baum of Mount Sorrel Life and Times.
My name is Stephen Baum. I was born at my home on the 15th of March 1939, just before the outbreak of World War II. I'm 75 years of age and was born at 42 Woffs Lane, Rothley. Now, that was Woffs Lane in Rothley, but it was later changed to Cross Lane in Mount Sorrel. And the reason for that being, I understand that the postmaster at Mount Sorrel wanted or needed more people on his register so that he could increase his salary from the post office. And the people who lived in Woffs Lane in Rothley were rather concerned about this because the properties in Rothley were generally worth more than in Mount Sorrel. My mum and dad, Graydon and Ruth Baum, were well known in the village. Mum was formerly Jake's, and she was born at the bakery on 46 Loughborough Road, Mount Sorrel. Both sides of the family were Methodists. We came from a long line of Methodists. Dad was a Pearl Assurance Company agent for Mount Sorrel, Rothley, Swithund, Woodhouse and Woodhouse Eaves and Quorn. And he used to go to one of those villages each day of the week to collect the odd copper or pence from individuals, mainly for life assurance policies. It was a very interesting job, and Dad became very much a counsellor to people, visiting their homes on a regular basis. And few of them could afford to have solicitors, and there were very few solicitors around in those days. And he used to go into the houses and listen to all the agonies and problems of the everyday life, and got to be known very much as a counsellor in the area as part of his job. Mum was not working at all when I was a child, but she ran the child welfare nursery in Mount Sorrel for over 50 years. Now, this was much before the National Health Service, and her role was to invite mums from the village, new mums, to come along to have their children weighed by a nurse, and they used to support the mums of the village of Mount Sorrel. And she did that for over 50 years, and I think finished about 1995. Mum also had a charity business raising money for various good causes, but particularly for the United Methodist Chapel that I will refer to later in this chat. Later on, she did work as a solicitor's assistant one day a week when she travelled into Leicester, but that was solely to pay for the education, particularly of my brother, and then later on for myself. My dad was a very keen sportsman, known in the locality for his sporting attributes. He was a cricketer of some standing, was captain and wicket-keeper of Mount Sorrel Cricket Club, and was on the books of Leicestershire and Warwickshire cricket counties, but unfortunately the pay was so small that he couldn't afford to become a full-time sportsman. They were both completely teetotal, and that comes from their Methodist background, and we may say something else about that later on.
Stephen, can you tell us where your parents met?
I was going on to
man?
say that.
Oh, that's fine.
Yes. Mum and Dad, I believe, met first at Rawlins Grammar School in Quorn. They used to walk to school, of course, from Mount Sorrel every day, and they were both involved in the church through their families. But I think that they first really got to know one another through being at Rawlins Grammar School, as it was in those days.
Was he a Mount Sorrel man?
Dad was born by the butter market. The house, The house, if you were stood on the other side of the road to the Butter Market, it's the house to the left on Watling Street corner.
Right.
He was born in the upstairs room there, and I think lived there for a few years before going on to live in Hawcliffe Road, and then later in Boundary House, which is the house on the corner of Boundary Road and Rothy Road. Again, from standing on the opposite side, the one to the left.
And was his family from Mount Sorrel as well? Were they all?
Yes, they were very much a Mount Sorrel family. My grandmother, who died when he was 14, came from Quorn, but she married and came to live in Mount Sorrel. And that of my parents in my early years was, of course, just an normal cycle. And we used to walk to the Methodist church, that's the United Methodist Church at 21 Leicester Road, sometimes 3 times on a Sunday, from 42 Cross Lane, which must be a good mile or over there, and back, and then another mile back. So that was, on some Sundays, a 6-mile hike, going in the morning, coming back for lunch, going to Sunday school in the afternoon, and then back, and then again in the evening. Not every week, but it could come to that. Dad was a society steward at the United Methodist Church for as long as I can remember, and used to be responsible really for the secretarial aspects of the church. He was the church treasurer, and interrelated with the Loughborough circuit of Methodism, which covered an area as far north, I think, as Kegworth, as far east as Wymeswold and Weissel, and Mount Sorrel was the furthest south in the circuit, with Woodhouse, Eves and Charley on the western side. It's my understanding that there were almost 200 Baums in Mount Sorrel in the late 19th century. And I come back from a family of Baums. It's a German name, Baum for tree, but it can be traced back into the 1500s of Baums who lived locally on our family tree, the earliest being from Thurkeston. Now, my father, Graydon Baum, his mum died when he was 14, and he used to lodge with his cousin Alwyn. Now, cousin Alwyn was the son of Stephen and Annie Baum, living in the company cottages on 120 Loughborough Road, Mount Sorrel. One evening after church at the United Methodist Chapel, and it was very much chapel in those days, my father and Alwyn, his cousin, went to a World War I recruitment drive on Mount Sorrel Hill. And both of them thought about it overnight and decided that they would like to join up. And the following morning went to Leicester Town Hall to register. Now, Alwyn, his cousin, was accepted into the Leicestershire Regiment, while my father, who was an engineer by trade, followed Alwyn to the table but was sent to Coventry to make ornaments because of his engineering background. And I think he worked at the Daimler and the Singer works, making ornaments in Coventry. Now, his cousin Alwyn, who was aged 18, was accepted by the regiment on the 31st of August 1914, and the attesting officer was Colonel Martin of the Brand in Swithland. Dad used to know Colonel Martin well, and on occasions I met Colonel Martin with my dad. He was, of course, the owner of the quarry in those days. The witness to Alwyn's signature on the attestation form was Mr. Boyer, who ran the bus company, Boyers, from Rothay. Now, Alwyn was killed in action on the 4th of June 1915, aged 19, at Kemmel in Belgium, and his grave is close by to Lindenhoek Chalet Military Cemetery. and I've been privileged to go to his grave on 2 occasions, and probably am the only Baum family member who's been able to go and visit Cousin Elwyn's grave. But I mention this because it just shows the fine dividing line of life. Because had my father been accepted and gone with the Leicestershire Regiment, it's almost certain he would have died in the First World War alongside his cousin, and I would not be here to tell this story. So Dad worked through the war, the First World War, in Coventry. But he started work at Morris's Cranes in Loughborough, and he used a bike to work to start at 6 a.m. And it was quite usual that punctures would damage the tyres, and he would have to get up early before then in the morning to repair a puncture before going off on his bike to Loughborough each day. For the Second World War, he was a part-time fireman at the Rothley Fire Station, which of course the building still exists on the green. He used to tell the story of the fact that another of his cousins was run over by a Boyer's bus. This other cousin was a conductor on the bus and was run over by one of the buses. I remember Boyer's buses very well, but he used to recount that his cousin's parents, who lived in Boundary Road, were so upset at losing their son that it was Dad's job to go upstairs in the house, 6 Boundary Road, to measure up his cousin for the coffin. And that played on my dad's mind a lot at that time. You can imagine, because he was a relatively young man as well. Another of Dad's interests was the cinema, and particularly the cinema at Birstall, which he used to go to on his afternoon off on a Wednesday afternoon, and to the Palace Theatre in Belgrave Gate in Leicester, where they used to have the old music halls. And I went with him on a number of occasions to hear the old musical hall acts, George Roby, just to name one, among many others. Before it was actually pulled down, the Palace Theatre, I saw a number of famous celebrities there, including, I remember, Shirley Bassey for one, for example, before, of course, it disappeared. I'd like to just share with you some of my early recollections. I remember being in my mum's bed on the south side of the house with her and my brother, and the sky was on fire. And Mum was as nervous as could be what she was experiencing, and cuddled up my brother and myself to her. And she said, "It's all right for you, Dad. He's in the ARP hut drinking tea with his mates up the road." But she said the next bomb could easily land on this house. That was an early experience of the war, and one of the other recollections is that we used to listen to the 8 o'clock news on the BBC Home Service every morning over breakfast on a crackling radio to get the latest news and the situation about the war. Now, Dad's brother was Roland Baum, and he died when I was 2 in 1941 of throat cancer. Roland was a real entrepreneur. He had his own dance band, and he persuaded my dad to play an instrument which there were very few of in this country, called the saxophone. The saxophone was an American instrument, and Uncle Roland had gone over to a music shop in Birmingham to buy this saxophone for my dad to play, and it was one of the first to be imported from the United States. He built Hilltop Garage on the south side of the village, and that was the first garage, I understand, in Leicestershire. It was built on the old London Road, of course, linking York to London, and he and my dad walked from Hathorn in the north of the county to Market Harbour in the south to determine where the best position would be to have a garage selling petrol for the first cars that came through the village. And my understanding is that in those days you could see Hilltop from the centre of Mount Sorrel, so cars could see the garage as they approached it from the north, and equally from the south, from as far south as Wanlip. The cars would be able to see that they were approaching a garage, which of course were very few and far between. And so Uncle Roland built Hilltop Garage and then built a cafe alongside in the form of Art Deco, and it used to have green cane furniture in it, as I remember it. And another aspect of that adventure from him was that he got fed up of sitting there waiting for cars to come, and he developed an air compressed unit that had a tube that ran across the forecourt, so that if a car went over the tube, it would ring a bell in the engineering shop that he got at the back. So he didn't have to sit and watch for cars coming up. And as a child, I remember they were on most forecourts in those days. So that was something that grew and was used a lot. Dad used to talk about the first car that he ever saw coming up the road with, of course, a flag, somebody carrying a red flag in front of it at 5 miles an hour. And that was down by the Anchor Hotel on the road to Quorn. Our home was a bungalow. It still exists today, number 42 Cross Lane. It had running cold water and a flushing toilet. We didn't have a bath. The bath was the bath in front of the fire on a Friday night, which was the only form of heating in the house to have an open fire. And I still have the kettle that we used to boil the water on the fire. We all had our baths on a Friday night. Mum's agony, and I use that word not lightly, was really doing the washing, because the washing had to be done in a dolly tub, often outside, even in the winter. And getting clothes dry was a really major issue for my parents. They did have a gas cooking stove and could boil a kettle on that, but because of the cost, most of the water was done on the fire. We used to have bed warmers and the old-fashioned pot hot water bottles to go to bed, as most people did. And of course, the fun was always when one cracked and you had a leak in the bed and trying to get the bed dry again afterwards. Life was not easy during the war. We had sandbags up to above the windows, both for protection but also to keep out any light from the house. And I often remember icicles forming on the inside of the glass because it was so cold. But there was nothing that one could do about that. It was part of life, and we had to live with it. My father grew vegetables in quite a nice vegetable pot behind the house. There were, of course, rations for food and for clothes. But once a week we used to have meat on a Sunday from Mr. Goodwin, who was the butcher on by the butter market. During the war, clothes were very short. Many of them were homemade. But we used to have, as a family, a new outfit for the Sunday school anniversaries. And Mum used to save up the ration coupons through the year so that we could be doled out for that special day that I'll share with you a little bit later. Now, my grandma lived at 46 Loughborough Road, which was one of the village bakeries. She was the baker because her husband died relatively young, and she carried on the business. She was a delightful soul and a real grandmother to me. But she never got over the fact that when she was out delivering bread one day in Holstead Road towards the top, she sold a loaf which was underweight, and as a result of that she was taken to court and fined. And that was such a blot on her life and her that she had a job to get over that. But that happened when the Weights and Measures inspector actually bought this loaf from her in Holstead Road. Right. My father later acquired a motorbike. It was a BSA Bantam bike, and he used this in the last years of his work rather than a cycle. And that bike was purchased by another well-known person in Mount Sorrel, and now resides in the museum at Stonehurst Farm. Another early recollection is that when I started to school, I unfortunately contacted a disease called erysipelas. I never heard of it, but within perhaps 48 hours, my nose grew in size by 2 or 3 times, and it had sort of water bags inside it. The doctor at the time, Dr. Walton, was very worried about me and didn't think that I would live. People with erysipelas generally died, and he decided to give me a very new form of treatment, penicillin, which he had never used before. I don't know quite where he got it from, but he managed to acquire some tablets and came to our house 3 or 4 times a day for a week to see the impact of the penicillin tablets. And within 3 or 4 days, it had gone. It was quite remarkable. I mean, he was absolutely staggered as the village doctor that it had had this effect. And thankfully, I'm here to tell the tale. Dr. Walton was a very interesting doctor. He used to suffer a lot himself, I think with arthritis, and could be very grumpy. But equally, he could be a brilliant doctor and really cared for those who he had in his charge. But I used to be frightened to death to go to the surgery on my own, and Dad used to often come with me, but he was almost as frightened of Dr. Walton as I was. But at least he saved my life with penicillin. Our faith has been very important to the whole Baum family, my forefathers over the years, and to, on my mother's side, the Jakes family too. My grandmother worked at the John Wesley Museum in London on City Road for a period, and she was the daughter of a Methodist minister. Some of my forefathers were local preachers and walked to as far as Charlie Chapel on a Sunday from Mount Sorrel to preach and then walk home again. It's said that when John Wesley came to Mount Sorrel in 1783, he went to Stonehurst Farm, and I believe he came back later as well, but he preached, and my forefathers were converted by John Wesley. And they went together and decided to build a chapel, the first Methodist chapel in Mount Sorrel, which was close to the river and the canal, on the opposite bank to what is now the Waterside pub near the Humpback Bridge. That's quite a feat, and I say that because most of them worked in the quarry from Monday to Saturday, starting work at something like 6 or 6:30 in the morning and finishing at 6 o'clock at night, and would not do any building, of course, on a Sunday, but they still actually built 3 Methodist churches in Mount Sorrel, one after the other. Because for some reason they were a bit of a rebellious lot, and when they fell out with the other people in the chapel, they would go on and build another one. So the first one was built opposite the Waterside pub on the other bank.
Does that building still exist, Stephen?
Not as far as I know. No, don't think it does. Then they built one up the post office yard.
Yeah, Jake's.
Well, there was the school. There was her school, but there was also the Methodist church that they built, and then they built the United Methodist Church at 21 Leicester Road, where the family used to go right through my lifetime, up to 1963, and perhaps we'll share a little bit about that later. And as we look into the garden now, there is the actual christening font that I was christened in, and all my forefathers were too, that came from the United Methodist Chapel.
So where is that building? Does that still exist?
Yes,
Stephen?
is it Vision Outlook? It's
Yes.
it's just north of Little Lane, Little Lane, by the parish rooms.
Yeah.
Yes.
The football team used to get changed.
Well, yeah. When we closed it, nobody wanted it, and it stood derelict for a few years, and then the football team team bought it. So, considering there were quarrymen who worked such long hours, it was an amazing feat, really, that they built these 3 Methodist churches. But their faith was so very important to them and central to their whole life. In my lifetime, there were 3 Methodist churches in the village. There was the United Methodist, where I attended, and then there was the Primitive Methodist at the bottom of Crown Lane, and then there was the Wesleyan Methodist, which is just north of the railway bridge on the left-hand side, for going towards Loughborough. These churches had some rivalry between them, and there was little in the way of harmony, and I don't use that word lightly, but between them. They all used to operate completely independently from when I was born right through to 1963. It was our family's second home, because there was no television and very little radio in those days, very little to do. And so all the community spirit came really from us going to the local church. And they used to have lots of entertainment, make their own entertainment, and we would always go there on a Saturday night, and often a couple of other nights during the week, sometimes during the day too, for, ladies' fellowship meetings and things of that nature. All of my family, I think, were christened and married there, other than myself. I was married actually at Kirby Muxlow Free Church. But it had a general room downstairs, which we used as a Sunday school, and then the actual church was upstairs, and it had a balcony. It had a very fine organ, and there was a BBC organist named Reginald Fort who came to play that organ quite regularly for fundraising events, and he said it was one of the best organs that he had ever played, and he used to love to come, and I remember that vividly, and he used to make this thing talk. One of the early memories of life in church was the Sunday school anniversaries. This happened in all the local churches, including the Baptist Church and I think the Christchurch Parish Church, where on one Sunday a year in each of the churches, the Sunday school would hold an anniversary, a celebration of singing and music. And we used to, what we call, sit up on benches that built on a scaffold over the pulpit. And it was often a very hot day in May or early June. My father used to conduct the choir, which was the Sunday school, plus a lot of adults, plus quite a lot of others that they used to rope in, so that their Sunday school anniversary was better than anybody else's. They got the Mount Sorrel Choral Society and other groups to come and help. And we used to sit up on this staging above the pulpit. And it got so hot up there one day that my friend who was sitting next to me blew off quite loudly. And one lady shouted out, "Like a damn farmyard up here," she said.
No,
which I think summed up the event very well indeed. But we used to have that event every year and usually have a new outfit of clothes for it. And we were always entertained at Crosby's grocery store, which I'll say a little bit about later, for tea between the afternoon session and the evening session. Now their toilet was right down the yard near the river. And I remember I got a new suit on and felt very dapper at the age of about 7 or 8, and went running down to this toilet down the yard and fell over into a puddle. And there were no other clothes that I could wear. And I remember them scrubbing me down and trying to get me dry so that I could sit up at the evening service at the Sunday school anniversary. I worked at Crosby's when I became a teenager. They were a very high-class grocer. Lizzie Crosby ran it in my era, but a family before her. And we used to weigh out the tea from huge tea caddies, and there were some lovely groceries to be had at Crosby's grocery. There were 2 or 3 other grocers in the village, but it was always Miss Crosby's aim to be able to attract the high-level people in the village, including the Martin family. And if we hadn't got what was on their grocery list, I used to be sent to the other grocers in the village to see if they got it and buy it from them and then take it back to put into their basket. Some of my boyhood memories were during the first years that I went to school. My first school, I went to Christchurch Primary School in Mount Sorrel, where Miss Bailey was the headmistress, and my teachers were Mrs. Lane and Mrs. King. It was a very caring time and a very caring school between the years 1944 and 1947. I remember particularly 1946 and the winter of 1946, which was one of the worst on record, because the snow in Cross Lane was in places 6 foot high, and we used to have to get through this to go to school. We can't believe that today, and of course it was because there were no cars or no transport that were driving through the road. But that was a very special time. From home, I used to play with friends in the road and in the lane where I lived. And it really was a lane in those days, because beyond number 46, it was just a cart track that gradually got thinner and thinner as you went up West Cross Lane to Gypsy Lane. Gypsy Lane was an area that we feared somewhat, because Romany gypsies used to be coming up and down the road and then into the lane regularly in their caravans, and we were somewhat scared of them as young children. Playing was fun. We used to play with a ball if we got a ball, and play hide and seek and other games. And there was quite a community atmosphere on Cross Lane. Not least, a memory is of VE Day, when we had a garden party in the street, in the middle of the street, where all the people who lived in the street came together and really had a party, and we had something really worthwhile to celebrate. An early recollection is the first television set that was in the road at the bottom of Johns Avenue, at the house owned by Mr. and Mrs. Wykes, because you could see this television from the road if you peered through the hedge. And the young children had never seen television very much, well, never seen it at all. And we used to peer through the hedge at this little screen that was probably 6 to 9 inches square, and just wonder at it. My first real recollection of television was for the Queen's coronation, when my Uncle John, who lived at number 46, bought a television for that great occasion. He had a house full. I guess there were upwards of 40 people who came to watch this one little television for the coronation, and of course it was a black and white television as well. Also in the street lived the Tyler's family. The Tyler family owned the hardware shop in Loughborough, which of course is now Tyler's shop in the centre of the town. And they had an air raid shelter at the top of their garden, and we used to play in their air raid shelter a lot with their son Noel, who later went on to be part of the business and lived at Quorn. I remember that in 1947 in Holstead Road we had quite an occasion when one of the local market gardeners who lived at number 34 was recorded for BBC for their gardening programme, and the programme was actually recorded or went out live from Holstead Road. And we just thought this was wonderful. And we stood in awe in the road as this lorry was doing all the work for that event. Another famous memory of mine was the 1949 Cup final, when Leicester City played Wolverhampton Wanderers and lost 1-0, I think it was. And I listened to that on a little crackling radio. And that was a very sad experience in the sense that Leicester City lost, but to have got to the cup final in those days was something very special. And particularly because the Leicester City centre forward who played for England was a guy named Jackie Lee from Sileby. And some of my friends and my father knew Jackie Lee, and he was playing in this very special match when the King presented the cup. I actually went on to work with one of the players who played in that cup final for Leicester City, and he said that the moment when they actually walked onto the pitch at Wembley was his most vivid memory of anything that he had ever experienced. He said the sound as you walked down the tunnel and onto the pitch was just something that he would never ever forget. I mentioned that I went to Christchurch Primary School and stayed there just for 3 years, from the age of 5 to 8, before going on to Loughborough Grammar School, and used to travel on special school buses that used to pick up at the bottom of Cross Lane, at the top of Holstead Road. And that was quite an experience, because it was the same children and pupils who were on the bus every day, and we used to have some real fun on that bus. But one day we got as far as Quorn and the bus was stopped. And it was because there had been an armed robbery at the Curzon Arms in Woodhouse Eaves. And it was the first robbery of its kind in Leicestershire. The first time that a gun had ever been used or branded in a robbery. And for days, the police were stopping every car and all the traffic and searching the buses to find the guys who were responsible for it. I can't even remember whether they ever did actually find them. I also remember the visit of King George VI and the Queen Mother in 1949 when they came to Leicester. And Mum took me to the Leicester station to see them arrive. And that's particularly memorable because we had no sweets or chocolate during my youth at all because of the war. But Mum had got hold of some chewing gum that day, and I was treated to my first chewing gum that was very special. It was beech nut chewing gum that she actually managed to acquire for the occasion. I never did very well at school. I didn't like it particularly, and I think at the grammar school in those days particularly, unless you were really good at something, you tended just to drift along. We had to go to school on Saturday mornings, and the guy that I used to sit with at school was named Richie Barker. Now, Richie was a footballer where the school was purely rugby, but Richie was such a good footballer that he played for Quorn Methodists, and he later went on to play for Derby County and for Notts Forest. But he used to miss school on Saturday mornings so that he could go and play soccer. And every Monday morning he was sent to the headmaster's study to be caned because he'd missed the schooling. I'm still in touch with Richie, and we've shared that experience a few times. It could be very cool at school too. We had a physical education teacher whose name was Williams, who took a delight in throwing pupils into the outside pool, whatever time of the year it was, on their birthdays. And I used to go in fear and trembling to school on that day because I knew that I was going to go into the pool. But perhaps even more sadly, he used to slipper boys with a plimsoll with full force onto their bare backsides in front of the whole class, and he wouldn't stop after 2 or 3 swipes. He'd probably have a dozen or more with you, which of course we can't believe happened today, but that again was a very, very frightening experience. I left school when I was 16, a little bit more about that in a moment, but another of my most vivid memories of my boyhood was being a member of first the Cubs and then the Scouts. The Cub mistress, Betty Wesley, who lived in in Hawcliffe Road, was a delightful lady, and she was our Cub master. And then we had a number of Scouters, including my brother Malcolm, Robert Lake, but most of all Mr. Bob Bates, who ran the whole Scout troop for the village. He was so dedicated to helping to see us grow through into young men. It was a great centre and a camaraderie spirit. For several nights a week used to go there to play Monopoly, to listen to the Goon Show and events of that nature. And of course our holidays were taken with the Scouts in camping. There was a billiard table, climbing ropes, and a nice kitchen where we could make a drink. We used to camp and go on a truck to Nipton in Rutland and to the Oaks in Charnwood, and later on to the Isle of Man and the Isle of Wight. And I had my first smoke during one of these camping trips, I remember, and I hated it, but had to go along with it because it was the done thing to do to have a smoke in those days. And I believe I have to say that I had pinched these cigarettes from when I worked at the Crosby's grocery store, for which I shall never forgive myself. We also used to go down to the Sowerby Loch to have a swim and a fish. Fishing and swimming in Sowerby Loch was one of the pastimes of those days. Our garden parties for the Scouts were held at the Lindens in Holstead Road, which later became a pub and has now, fortunately, been knocked down. But that was owned by a millionaire, and it was a house and garden that really had some standing, and we were allowed to hold our garden parties there. But on one occasion we held our garden party at Kinchley House in Kinchley Lane, and I have vivid memories of going on the railway, the Quarry Railway, standing in one of the trucks that had been hosed out and being taken on the train through to Barrow-on-Soar. A friend of mine, Andy Salmon, owns that very engine that pulled the train in those days, and is in the process of restoring it. And he told me only this week that his aim is to have it up and running within 2 years.
That name of the engine?
I forget the name of the engine. I'm sorry, I can't tell you. But that was an experience that I well remember, because it was jolting up and down all the while, and it was very dusty, despite the fact that it had been hosed out from quarry dust.
Valerie Joyce interviewing Stephen Baum on Friday, the 20th of June, regarding his story of Mount Sorrel, beginning with his cousin.
I'd like to share with you something about my father's cousin, John Baum, who lived at 46 Wafts Lane, which later became Cross Lane, and was one of the real characters of Mount Sorrel. He had a market garden, and he was one of 5 market gardeners with the name Baum in Mount Sorrel. 2 of the others were off Boundary Road and Holstead Road, and Edgar Baum, who was on Rothy Road. John Baum's garden, market garden, was off Cross Lane, where the Gelson houses now stand. He was a specialist in tomato and cucumber growing, and grew them for the top London hotels, and those were always wrapped up very specially in pink tissue paper and put into special boxes before they went to market. So they were immediately identified as his top quality vegetables. I used to work for what I called my Uncle John during the summer holidays, and worked very hard, 5 days a week, and at the end of it, if I was lucky, he'd give me 2 shillings, which of course is 10p in today's money. He would also hand me a cucumber and a tomato for my mum, but Mum was always very upset that was as much as I ever got for a really hard week's work. Uncle John was the village healer. He used to go to many different people's houses, attending to nasties such as boils and styes. And this was, of course, before the days of penicillin and other antibiotics. And he was a real expert at bathing them, and he'd go to people's houses 2 or 3 times a day when they were in real pain to bathe them. And I'm sure that he saved some people's lives through his actions. He kept pigs and chickens, and during the war we always used to have the side of a pig in my bedroom that he'd grown on for my father. We used to pluck and kill the chickens and Most of them he sold to individuals rather than sending them either to the market or to the butchers. He died around 1955, and there was a big question mark over what to do with his market garden, which had got a lot of glass houses, and we never thought that we'd find a buyer for it. His daughter, Hilda Baum, who later became Hilda Ricketts, was pounced on by the building company Jelsons, who at that time had not built many homes in Leicestershire at all, although they were a Leicester company. And we couldn't believe it when they offered to pay £5,500 for this plot of land, in which I understood that they were going to build 22 houses on the original plot, but in fact built 25 and paid this £5,500, which in those days was a huge sum of money, and never expected to raise that sort of money from it. I have very fond memories of Uncle John. He was the superintendent of the Sunday school, that's the United Methodist Sunday School, and he did that religiously for many, many years. And his favourite hymn was, "I found a friend, oh, such a friend in Jesus." And he used to sing it with such gusto that made a real impression on me as a boy. Uncle John never knew when it was time to go home in an evening. He was very late at going to bed. He loved talking. He loved board games, particularly draughts and chess. And my dad used to say to him at 10 o'clock, "Well, John, I'm going to bed. When you go out, please close the door," because Dad got up relatively early in the morning. John didn't need much sleep, and that was the only way really to get rid of him. He had a cellar in his house, and though I have very few memories of it during the war, when the sirens sounded, we all used to go round to Uncle John's and to go into his cellar, along with other people in Waffs Lane. It was the last house in Cross Lane in those days, other than one house at number 96, which was owned by a family of Germans called Eichen. And during the war, Mr. Eichen had to go to the Isle of Man and was unable to stay with his family. From the house where Uncle John lived, Waffs Lane was just a cart track right through to what is still Gypsy Lane. And we used to be very frightened when the Romany caravans came up the road with the gypsies in them, because they used to come round to the houses trying to sell us their wares and whatever, and we never felt very comfortable with them. Cross Lane, or Waffs Lane, from that point was a complete unmade road and was very narrow indeed. And I used to play on the road, of course, during the day and during the evening without any problems at all with friends from the lane. Uncle John bought a television set, of course it was black and white, in 1953 for the Queen's coronation. And I can't remember how many people were in his front room to watch this television, but he invited the whole street and probably many friends as well. And there must have been 50 people in the room while the coronation was going on. But that was one of my very first experiences of seeing a television. As I've already mentioned, Uncle John was a keen member of the United Methodist Church, one of the three Methodist societies in the village. Many of the Baums attended the United Methodist Church, and my parents were married there, my brother was married there, and it has many other family connections, not least because of the the organ that was bought for that building in 1923 and was reckoned to be one of the best organs for the size of the building in the country. The United Methodist Church was on Leicester Road at number 21, just south of Little Lane and close to the parish room. My father was a steward, and as already mentioned, we used to go to church, or chapel of course as it was known, 3 times on a Sunday. There were 2 other Methodist societies in the village, one at the bottom of Crown Lane, now that was the Primitive Methodist Church, and one just north of the Quarry Railway line, that was the Wesleyan Methodist Church. The Wesleyan Methodist Church had the best suite of premises by far, but the 3 societies in the village all were completely separate and had very little to do with one another. But by 1963, congregations had dwindled substantially in all 3 churches. The Loughborough circuit of Methodism, short of ministers and local preachers, and the new superintendent minister, the Reverend Dennis Robson, who I highly admired, was the superintendent minister for the Loughborough circuit, and he recognised immediately that something had to be done. He came and sounded out the 3 societies, and there was much resentment between the 3, but eventually we could see that it was going to become a necessity. He brought together the members of the 3 churches to share their thoughts, and we had several meetings. And there was a gentleman named James Thornton who attended the Wesleyan Methodist Church and lived in the Willows on the Leicester Road, who was an inspired layman, and he really inspired the rest of the congregations himself to seriously consider coming together. It would have been possible for us to have all joined up and to have met at the Wesleyan Methodist Church, but the members from the other 2 societies felt that this was not going to be the right thing to do, and that we should look to building a new church. We had a solicitor in the Methodist circuit, Mr. Barron, and he was exceptionally helpful and started to look for a suitable site where we could build a new church. And that was the one that was chosen in Churchill Road. And the house on the corner of Churchill Road and Rothy Road was bought as the manse for the Methodist minister. After several years of talking, the 3 societies amalgamated, held joint services to start with at the Wesleyan Church, but in the knowledge that we were going to build a new premises. A building fund was opened, and my auntie, Dorothy Jakes, who lived in Johns Avenue, was the treasurer. There were 3 stewards appointed for the combined church. This was Jim Thornton, who I've mentioned, Colin Bowler, who lived at 108 Rothy Road, and myself. And an architect was appointed, Mr. John Allen from Wanlip. There was no way that we could have raised the amount of money that was required for a new church without the help of some funds from outside, and we approached the Rank Trust, which was owned or started by J. Arthur Rank, well known of course for his films and too for his flour and bread. and he offered a sum of money to help to build the church. But one member of the Wesleyan Society, who felt that the churches should not come together, wrote to J. Arthur Rank and said that he was wasting his money and that he should withdraw the offer. And so one day, J. Arthur Rank, chauffeur-driven in his Rolls-Royce, just landed in the village, went to Jim Thornton's house. Jim Thornton came home from work, and he worked for Goddard's, the silver polish manufacturers in Leicester, who later became part of the Johnson Group, and he went to live in the United States at their head office eventually. But J. Arthur Rank came and visited several homes in the village to talk through the need for the new church. And we were delighted when he said that he would continue to support the venture. A lot of money was raised, lots and lots of fundraising events of one sort or another were held, and the new church was opened in 1970 with a sports hall added to on land at the back in 1978. A minister was appointed for this church, the Reverend Norman Peck, who was a lovely man and very well respected in the village. And by the time that the sports hall was added in 1978, we had the Reverend Doug Brewer as our minister, and he, together with some other local enthusiasts, did much of the work on the extension of the hall themselves. Doug, in fact, trained as a carpenter and loved the experience of being involved in the building of this, what was a magnificent hall at the time. Methodism did flourish for a time after the building of this new church, and it was a very modern building for its time, and together the three former societies did form a fairly united front. I'm a little reserved in what I say there because there were some people still in the three societies who would like us to have kept our individual buildings. But through the work of the ministers, firstly Norman Peck and secondly Doug Brewer, we did form a united society. And soon after we'd opened the extension, it was felt that the church had lost its way in terms of its spirituality. We had to put all the effort into building this new church, and money-raising events took over from the spirituality of the church. And one of our members suggested that we should involve an organisation, predominantly Methodism, but also working in Baptist and Anglican churches, that was made up of lay Christians from all over the country. And we agreed to have a lay witness weekend in our church in March 1980. On a personal basis, as one of the stewards, I was dead against this. I thought no one from outside can come and help us with developing our spirituality. And how wrong I proved to be. This weekend was very special for the Methodists in the village, and a number of people found it a very, very moving experience. Not least myself, because up to that point I'd been going to church meetings for so long, and most nights of the week was present somewhere in Methodism churches in the Loughborough circuit. But these individuals who came to our church made a very lasting impression, and I felt God calling me to change my way of helping to develop Methodism and to concentrate in my faith in becoming one with him. And that was a profound moment for me and too for my wife Wendy. In the consolidation of the three groups of Methodists in the village, we decided to form an amateur dramatic group and called ourselves the Castle Players. There were mainly youngsters in the group, and we were very privileged to have as our producer Colin Bowler, who was a regular performer at the Little Theatre in Leicester. A number of the Castle Players put on 2 or 3 productions each year that were held at the Scout Hut on the Green. The group included Wyn Smith, Jeff Wainwright, Carol Jordan, Linda and Brenda Thornton, Colin Bowler himself, and myself. There were others too, but they are just a few of those who took part in these productions on a regular basis, and it was very successful in bringing the young adults of the churches together and giving us a united front in front of the consolidated church. Now, when it came to me leaving school at the Loughborough Grammar School, I had been an underachiever and was one evening at my Auntie Dorothy Jake's in Johns Avenue's home, and she spoke to me about taking up a job, feeling that my education had really come to an end and that I was not going to do too well in my examinations that were coming up later in the year. And Auntie Dorothy was quite an influential person in Leicester, working for a solicitor, and she offered to try and get me a job in the city. I was age 16 at the time, and just 2 days later she asked me to go and see her, and she'd arranged for me to have 2 interviews on the following Saturday. One with an accountant and one with the city treasurer in the town hall. I went for these 2 interviews on the Saturday morning because, of course, in those days businesses were open on a Saturday morning, and both of them offered me a job. And I decided to take the one with the city treasurer to be paid £3, 11 shillings and sixpence per week, and went there as a trainee, taking some of the local government exams in the succeeding years. Why I chose that as a profession, I've no idea, because I was not particularly good at figures or mathematics. But that's the way of the world, and I was interviewed by the Deputy City Treasurer, Mr. Sidney Kent, and he appointed me. One of the roles within the City Treasurer's department was to pay all the staff of Leicester Corporation, including the firemen, the refuse collectors, the school staff, the police, and day nursery people. And I used to walk from the town hall to the Westminster Bank in St Martin's every day to fetch the money for the wages. And this could be as much as £30,000, and used to carry it in a leather case, walking there and walking back with the money, and never felt unsafe at all. But that was the way of the world in those days. When it did come to the Christmas holidays and the holiday season, the money that used to go into the wage packets often came to perhaps up to £100,000, and then I was allowed to have a taxi to go and collect the money. But often went on my own, sometimes with an assistant, but that was one of the roles that I undertook, to go and collect the money and then to spend the next day putting all the wages into packets for distribution to the various organisations within the corporation. I worked there for, I think, about 6 years, and then was seconded to the Leicester Education Authority in Newark Street as a assistant cashier, but also worked at the De Montfort Hall, which was owned and still is owned by the corporation, and in those days used to look after some of the ticket money from the concerts, held perhaps 3, 4 or 5 nights a week, and the money from the programme sales. But in those days, there were only a small group at the De Montfort Hall, and so we all used to, may I use the term, muck in. And as part of that, I met so many very, very famous celebrities, including a lot of the top jazz musicians of the era. People like Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, for whom I carried her wigs up the back stairs into her dressing room. The same for a lady named Shirley Bassey, who had just come onto the scene, and many, many others. Perhaps the most regular big-time performer in those days was Cliff Richard. And Cliff came to the De Montfort Hall for the first time in 1958 in a fluorescent pink suit, which he'd travelled in an old car up from London in, and went onto the stage in that suit, accompanied by a group that had just been formed called the Shadows. I remember talking to him on one occasion when he'd just come back from South Africa the previous day, where he was a great star there as well as in England. And I was with him on the side of the stage just before he went on, and he couldn't speak. He'd lost his voice completely. And I remember saying to him, "Now, Cliff, how are you going to handle tonight's performance?" He said, "It doesn't matter. The screaming is going to be so loud." He said it doesn't matter whether I sing or not. They used to do 2 performances in an evening, and when individuals like Cliff Richard and many others came to the De Montfort Hall, there were lots of young ladies present screaming their heads off. And one of my jobs was, between performances, to take away any seats that had been wet during the performance. It wasn't just, of course, for pop stars and jazz musicians, but also for big orchestras, and was so privileged to meet people like Andre Previn and Sir John Barbarolli at that time, who were among the leading conductors in the world. There was one night in particular that you might be interested to hear of. There was a pop singer named Freddie and his Dreamers, who were on show at the De Montfort Hall on a Sunday evening. And Freddie was a very interesting Liverpudlian and a character. And I remember sitting in his dressing room with him and chatting things through. And he used to jump around in his dressing room, and he said, "Stephen," he said, "we must go to the side of the stage. There's a group of artists who are about to perform who I've never heard, but I'm told are going to be very big indeed." On that evening, they were bottom of the bill, but it was Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones doing what I believe was their first gig outside of London. And I was privileged to stand on the side of the stage while they were performing, and I well remember one of the guitarists, Bill Wyman, coming to the side of the stage and just chatting to Freddie during the performance and saying, "I can't believe what's happening. There are all these girls out there screaming at us." And he said, we've never experienced anything like this in our lives. And in fact, at the end of the performance, they were quite concerned about their security because there was not one policeman in the building. And I met the Rolling Stones on a number of occasions and did find Mick Jagger a very well-educated and a very nice person to talk to. I could talk for a long while about those experiences, but one of my hobbies was to take photographs, and I used to take photographs of some of these legends as they are today in the latter time at the De Montfort Hall. And when they returned to the De Montfort Hall, I asked them to sign the photographs of themselves, including the Rolling Stones, and I photographed the Beatles. And a few years ago was involved in one of the Antiques Roadshow programmes showing my pictures. And they told me that one particular picture of the Rolling Stones that had been signed was worth £3,000, to which I nearly dropped. I have been privileged to meet a number of celebrities over the years, and probably the highlight of that experience was to meet two of the men who actually walked on the moon. That was Al Bean, who was on Apollo 12 in 1970, and Edgar Mitchell, who was on Apollo 14 in 1972. That was a hugely special experience, to shake their hands and to talk through with them, just very superficially, what they were doing today. And I remember Al Bean saying to me that he likes to be tucked up in bed by 10 o'clock at night. In 1963, I'd worked for the Leicester Corporation for a number of years and was beginning to have itchy feet. And I mentioned a friend named Jim Thornton before, who was working in industry and suggested to me that perhaps there might be a better opportunities for me to move out from local government, despite the fact that by that time I had taken some local government exams and had been successful and was beginning to feel that there would be a career there for me, but felt it to some extent it was a dead-end job. And Jim Thornton pushed me into writing a letter to a new company in Loughborough called Riker Laboratories, who were a pharmaceutical company set up for an American parent company based in California. He said, just write them a letter and tell them that you'd be interested in working for them and see what they say. And I couldn't believe that within a few days a letter came through the door inviting me to go for an interview. I had no idea what job I was going to be interviewed for, but found myself in the manager's office of the production department, where they offered me a job as a work-study assistant. My parents, to some degree, were very reluctant for me to take a job that I had no idea what I was going to do, and particularly in industry, because Mum and Dad had not worked in industry. But this friend, Jim Thornton, pushed me into really accepting the job. And I never look back on that experience and will always be grateful for the opportunity. Riker Laboratories became 3M company in 1970, and before it was taken over, I had started to work myself up and was appointed as a manager in the personnel department, as it was then, which of course is human resources, HR today. And when I was promoted to a manager, I had a letter from the managing director of the company to say that from then on I didn't have to call him Mr. Lumley but could call him John. But also in the same envelope was a key to a special toilet, a golden key that was just used for the management and was now allowed to use this manager's toilet. I moved on fairly swiftly from work study, although I did pass the examinations, but really didn't like the conflict of being in that situation, but loved to be in HR management. And again, the same managing director, John Lumley, called me into his office one day, and he just returned from Germany, where he'd heard about some experiences of companies in Germany working flexible hours, something that had not at that point reached the UK. He tried to make out that he knew all about it and also expected me to know everything about it too. And of course I knew absolutely nothing. But he said, Stephen, he said, I'm setting you a challenge that in 6 months' time we will have flexible working hours from across the whole company. And he said, I will be included in that. Now, I had no idea what flex time was at all. And there was nobody else in the UK to really find out very much about it from. But through digging and delving, through contacts and other sources, I managed to find out about how this potential system worked. And we did introduce flex time for all staff, both on the factory floor and through to the managing director in 1972. We were fortunate that there was no union in the company in those days, but some of the staff were so worried about what we were trying to do in the company that they actually went on strike for the very first time. And of course, that was my responsibility for this strike action. But it was really, in those days, done for two reasons. One, to help the staff, and they couldn't understand why we were trying to help the staff. But equally, that in Loughborough, it was very difficult to recruit staff at any level. And here were we, a relatively young company, and we saw this as a possibility for bringing in people from other companies in the area. It immediately hit the headlines and was the headlines a week or two later on the ITN News, the national television station, and later within the BBC. And the BBC rang me one day and said, could they come and make a programme about what we were doing? And that became the start of what a great opportunity for me as an individual and also for the company, because it spread the name of the company, not just across the UK, but I was invited to take seminars across Europe. And a friend of mine who worked with me on it, who was a researcher at Loughborough University, he asked me to write a book with him, which I did, called A Practical Guide to Flexible Working Hours, that became quite a big seller in business over the following years. It gave me the opportunity to travel. Marks and Spencer's invited me to go to the University of Tel Aviv in Israel to talk through my experience in this field, because in Israel at that time many people had to have two jobs to make a living, and it gave them the opportunity to have some flexibility between finishing one job and starting another one during the evenings. So that was a special time in my life, and took part in a number of BBC television programmes and radio programmes on the subject. By that time I was married, in 1966 and moved away from Mount Sorrel to live in Loughborough in Loweswater Drive. And my wife Wendy and I were privileged to have a boy and a girl as our offspring. And 7 years later, we moved back to 23 Holstead Road, Mount Sorrel, where I lived for 33 years, before moving to my present home here in Rothley. During that time, I continued to support Mount Sorrel Methodist Church as a steward and worshipped there regularly up to 1994, when we felt that it was time to move on and joined the Rothley Parish Church, for which we've never looked back. It's been a great blessing to us and was one of the key reasons for us moving from Mount Sorrel to Rothley. And behind that was probably partly due at least to the fact that there was no Sunday school for our children, the Methodist Church at Mount Sorrel. I'm now 75 years of age. I had, for many years, an international job, which took me to many different parts of the world, a very exciting and interesting career, and since retiring have been very busy and active in different ways. I didn't mind retiring one little bit, although my wife Wendy was very concerned about whether, having had the sort of lifestyle that I've been used to, I would be happy to be at home, but very much found that a great blessing, and I've been very privileged to enjoy so much across the 75 years of my life.